A lot of companies have a customer obsession value, but we really wanted to make it clear that the person we think about on a day-to-day basis, the person who has to love Docker, is the developer.
That's Justin Cormack, the CTO of Docker. Over the past decade, Docker exploded in popularity as companies moved to the cloud and adopted Docker's software containers as they did. But the company struggled as a business and 5 years ago made massive changes.
When we restructured, people were like, well, I kind of hope this works, but I doubt it will.
Well, 5 years in and Docker's developer obsession is paying off. The company is now bigger than it ever was. On this episode of Crafted, we'll discuss developer productivity, how Docker is building products to improve it, and why so many organizations are in an awkward phase with too many responsibilities being put onto the developer.
We've had this shift left movement of putting more work onto developers. They're being asked to do more with less support.
Plus, we'll look outside the container for new vectors of growth.
Almost all of our customers are implementing some form of AI, and often for the first time.
And Justin will share tips for developers on how they can better communicate their needs and what CFO-types can do in return.
The one thing they can do is actually listen to the developers.
Welcome to Crafted, a show about great products and the people who make them. I'm Dan Blumberg, I'm a product and growth leader, and on Crafted, I'm here to bring you stories of founders, makers, and innovators that reveal how they build game-changing products and how you can too. Crafted is brought to you in partnership with Docker, which helps developers build, share, run, and verify applications anywhere without environment confirmation or management. More than 20 million developers worldwide use Docker's suite of development tools, services, and automations to accelerate the delivery of secure applications. Learn more at docker.com. And Crafted is produced by Modern Product Minds, where my team and I can help you take a new product from 0 to 1 and beyond. We specialize in early-stage product discovery, growth, and experimentation. Learn more and sign up for the Crafted newsletter at modernproductminds.com. Justin, I understand that not only are you CTO of Docker, you also love to ferment things. Would you say that great software needs to ferment?
Software does take time and experimentation, but actually fermentation's kind of interesting because actually a lot of it is actually about measurement and control, and it's actually fairly repeatable. Temperature and measurement and things are actually kind of quite important. I think the most important thing you can have if you're a beginner in cheese, for example, is a pH meter to measure the acidity. It's kind of useful to know what's going on and whether you've got it right. Measurement and metrics are also important, but in a kind of different sort of way, because software's often less repeatable, but the measurement parts are for different reasons, like how how's this performing? Am I getting there? Is this helping the user? Is this what's going wrong with the software? So it's similar, but
Gotcha. I promise I'll move off this analogy in a second, but I am curious how the new Docker is fermenting. It's been 5 years since Docker recapitalized and refocused, and I'd love to understand how are all the ingredients coming together.
Yeah, I mean it's been an amazing success. I think that when we restructured, people were like, well, I kind of hope this works, but I doubt it will. And it's actually been an incredible success. We're larger and stronger than we were before. When Docker started, it was an open source project that just exploded and led to this huge amount of innovation across the whole space. But it took a few years before Docker trying to build a business out of that. And it was very early back then. And we started building a product around deployment and operations of Docker Swarm and later Kubernetes. That was a really crowded market. And at the time, it was quite small, relatively. It's huge now. It was also kind of interesting because it was our core original customers were developers, and this was an operations product. So the people who'd made Docker successful were not really the buyers for this product. So we pivoted back to those original people who had made Docker successful, who were so excited by it, which was the developer community. And we built a business around them. That was the real change, was really going back to our roots, going back to our core audience and building products for them.
Docker lists as one of its values developer obsession. What does it mean to be developer obsessed?
Yeah, so we spent a long time thinking about, our values and why we were doing things and what we were doing, particularly as we restructured the company. And a lot of companies have a customer obsession value. Amazon is a famous one. But we really wanted to make it clear that the person we think about on a day-to-day basis, the person who has to love Docker, is the developer. And there's a bit of nuance between the developer and the customer, because when you think of the customer, you think of the buyer versus the end user. And we really wanted to focus on the fact that, it's the developer who loves Docker. It's the developer who is going to be using Docker every day and cares about performance, cares about how it works, cares about usability and all those things. And they're the people who tell their manager and they tell the organization that they want Docker and that they should buy Docker. And also, we're a software company, we're full of developers, and part of it is just channeling the customer zero focus on am I shipping something that I want to use as a developer? As a developer, am I proud of this? Am I thinking about the quality aspects that developers find important?
Docker's growth really tracked the move that companies made to the cloud. Can we just step back for a second? What is the value of containers, and why was it that was such a critical piece of the move to the cloud?
Docker grew up really with the microservices movement. And if you think about microservices, microservices were about organizations suddenly got a lot more developers. Development became more important because everything was turning into software. And so if you've got more developers, you have to organize them. They've got more teams. And microservices was around how can we split responsibility between teams to work effectively without having to understand a gigantic context of huge applications. And so containers will let you deploy pieces of your application as microservices, separate out the differing responsibilities, separate out things like databases from code and so on, and let people work with smaller domains, separate out things like APIs and do API-driven development and so on. So there's a lot of breaking down of the problem into pieces, combined with a lot around the kind of the cloud native way of working around repeatability, automation, being able to understand what was going on. Probably the biggest workflow change with the containers is you build something, you test it, and then you deploy it. And if you want to change it, you start again at the beginning of that pipeline. You build a new version, you test it again, you deploy it again. And so there's a straightforward pipeline, and you can record metadata on exactly what went into production. You know what went when, you can revert things easily. And so everything about what's running in production is going through the same version controlled, container controlled pipeline. And that gives you that repeatability. It gives you the understanding of when there's something goes wrong, you know what's in production. You don't have to go back and spend your time triaging, well, what did change? Why is this broken? What changes actually are in production versus what we had in production last week, when it was working fine. And so those kind of pieces around repeatability and teams working together, separation of concerns, and around understandability, and which also help drive the whole observability movement of trying to collect better data so you can understand better what's going on.
So a lot of what you just described, solves a lot of true pain points for engineering teams, for product teams. A lot of those products are not new. I'm curious how in the last 5 years you've taken those products and obviously built others that ladder up to a much better business for Docker.
Yeah, absolutely. When we started looking at the restructuring, we looked at what we had. We looked at what had been growing organically over the last few years. We looked at where we spent a lot of time, talking to developers and understanding where their pain points were on the development side. A lot of what we were just talking about was, and where a lot of the innovation had happened in the kind of deployment and production side. We decided to focus our piece on the developer side and kind of further downstream from that. And that was for a number of reasons. One is that there's been way less investment in that area. Developers have been kind of left to work out how to deal with this stuff. And there was actually a big complexity gap between the developer experience and the operator experience that got messier in a way over the time. Kubernetes is a complicated technology, and the set of technologies around it are complex. And so the operations side of businesses had decided that they would keep that stuff mostly away from developers. And so developers deploying containerized applications had a kind of different view of the world from what had been going on, and fewer tools and support for them. But at the same time, we've had this shift left movement of putting more work onto developers, and they were being asked to do more with less support, and there was less investment in that developer ecosystem. So we decided that would be a productive area to focus. Docker continues to invest in speed and reliability in Docker Desktop. We've invested a huge amount in getting it better, but we know that that alone isn't sufficient for great developer experience combined with the control that enterprises want. So we're building this multi-product strategy to really focus in on this. We've launched Scout and Docker Build Cloud as part of that, both speeding up the inner loop. Docker Build Cloud saves you time by speeding up builds, and then you iterate faster, and Scout provides insights early on into security vulnerabilities that can be avoided before you go out of loop or to production. So combining these with the verified images on Docker Hub and the trusted content, this enables, far more than just portability and consistency that Docker pioneered. It reduces the time for dev teams, speeds up build time, frees up devs to iterate faster, focus on the inner loop, and makes building secure code easier, while giving you support with policies and remediation guidance from your DevSecOps teams.
You mentioned shift left a second ago, and I just want to make sure everyone understands. I think that's a key concept of what developers are being asked more and more to do. Can you explain what shift left means?
Yeah, so shift left is really, the initial observation was just that the later you fix something, the more expensive it is to fix. If you have a bug and it gets into production and it causes issues for customers and it's months after you wrote the code, then that's expensive to fix. If you have the bug and you find it while you're on your laptop before you've even pushed it to Git, and you go, oh yes, I shouldn't do that, let me fix it. So the sooner you can do things, the quicker it is, and the cheaper it is, and the more efficient it is. And that's also definitely very much true of security. Security issues much worse when they're in production than if you fix them early on. And that's why we talk about the inner loop, outer loop as well. The inner loop is that time when you're in flow of writing code and getting things, fixing things, and you want things to be fast. And that's the point that if you can fix things, then that's the furthest left. The outer loop is the kind of CI push. If you find issues there, for many people, the kind of CI push is still too slow. And that's, again, one of the things with Docker Build Cloud that we're trying to speed up is through the caching and so on, is the outer loop. But often for people, you talk to developers and they'll be in a cycle that they don't run most of the tests locally because of configuration and other reasons. They push to CI, you don't get feedback for a couple of hours, by which time you've kind of lost the context and it comes back. But that's still, even that is still quicker than it's running in production and a customer complains about it a week later and says, why did you ship this terrible software? You should never have shipped that. It's clearly broken. And then you have to go and fix that. And that's even more expensive. But it's also, shift left is also been a kind of excuse to put more burden on developers. And developers have to be supported in these activities. And they have to have things prioritized. They have to try and understand what the things they need to actually fix are, because if they were obvious, they would have fixed them anyway. So right. They obviously, they kind of need tooling to help them understand that.
With that in mind, and with the additional responsibilities that developers are being given, how do you prioritize Docker's roadmap?
The number one thing is listening to customers. We have a lot of customers, and particularly a very diverse set of customers. We have, from the largest enterprises to some individual developers. So listening to them is really important because there's so many of them and they're so different in their use cases. And Docker's such a broad tool. There's so many different ways people use it and different difficulties they run into. So that's a lot of the work is really just spending time with customers, understanding what they're finding difficult, where they are organizationally, and how their organization is thinking about how this fits in, talking to the teams that look after developers. I mean, platform teams have been really becoming a real thing for most organizations we talk to in the last few years, and those are really those teams are really thinking about how they help developers in a very focused way now. So spending time talking to them and understanding their problems helps us understand developer problems.
You mentioned there's so many different types of customers. There are 20 million developers that use Docker in one way or another. And if the number I found on the web is to be believed, there's 27 million developers worldwide. So you have incredible market penetration among developers. It also means I'm guessing that you're thinking a lot about ways you can deepen existing relationships with developers. Can you share more on how you approach that challenge?
There's a lot going on for developers in many ways. It's as we said, more is being put on them because more things are becoming software, and so it's a really interesting time from that point of view. The saying is that the future is unevenly distributed. It's very true that there are organizations that are fully containerized, but you still go out and talk to people who are starting on that journey, and there's also this very wide spectrum of users at different parts of the journey. I've been at Docker for 9 years now, and one of the things that's been fascinating to watch is our audience grows. The kind of questions they ask and the kind of issues they have changed so much, because the early adopters were quite sophisticated users. Now it's everyone is using Docker, and they're using it for a very broad set of use cases. For a long time, it was most of our users were on Linux, and then Mac and Linux, and now most of our users are on Windows. And the Windows users come from a very different background, and they have different view of the world. They tend to be more familiar with GUIs than command lines, but again, there's a big spectrum within them as well. And then, I think that obviously things like AI in the last few years have really affected the developer as well.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask, what are the conversations that are most sort of timely and relevant with Docker's customers? I imagine AI is very much one of those things.
Almost all of our customers are implementing some form of AI, and often for the first time. So last year we released the Docker GenAI stack, which is a kind of example RAG stack. So RAG is one of the most common patterns people use for building AI applications. And we've talked to customers who are planning to build hundreds of RAG applications. So RAG is retrieval augmented generation. It's basically where you take some set of data that you have, often, for example, documents, but it might be images or video and things as well. And you want to use a generic LLM model to actually, answer questions, but it doesn't know anything about your specific data. So a RAG app, you build a retrieval engine in front that adds the context in so that it can answer with relevant information. And this has become a very successful pattern. It's very widely used. It's not the simplest thing to actually build and deploy in production. And we're talking to a lot of customers about how to make that production journey better. There's lots of low-level pieces of the stack that just AI makes more important, like working with GPUs. But we're generally interested in how AI tooling is going to affect all of development and the kinds of ways we can help developers in a more broad way. We have a Docker Copilot plugin that helps you with Docker-related questions. But we're also interested in there's a lot of tooling that developers use and things they do on a day-to-day basis where AI could help them that are not just specifically about coding. It's one of the questions we've been looking at is how do we help developers use particular tools? Docker Hub has thousands of tools or millions of tools in containers, but it's not always obvious if I have a problem, how do I solve it? You spend a lot of time working out how to do ad hoc things, and AI is actually quite good at helping you do these things. People are realizing that developers are expensive, and if you can give them some more productivity, it's actually really valuable. And they waste a lot of time doing things that are not productive. And so why not invest the same as you do in other parts of your organization on productivity tools? I think that this is starting to change. People are understanding that these tools are really valuable for developers, and the amount of investment that's going in is increasing the amount of value that you're getting out of them every year. And developers are asking for this not because they are trying to waste you money. They're actually asking for this because it really helps them do their job.
What is the cutting edge of Docker R&D that is going to drive the next, big productivity gain, the next 5 years?
Well, we talked about the AI pieces. And I think AI is really interesting just from the point of view that developers have adopted it really fast compared to a lot of other areas. And it's actually, I think there's a lot of things that are really good about the ecosystem that we built in, particularly in sort of cloud native development, where it actually makes it easier to deploy AI. Because, like, for example, like we have tests, so we can see if the AI generated code is terrible, like more easily. And we have this structure of how you build stuff that is reliable, and you have checks and balances before things go to production. Although the infrastructure we have in order to deploy AI assisted tooling is better than many other industries, because we have that formalization and we have that understanding. So I think there's a lot we can do with AI. There's still a lot of complexity, but you can encapsulate that and modularize it in a more effective way, so that you don't have to understand it all at once, or it can be divided up, amongst teams. So developers understand the context in which their application runs. The ops people understand the context in which production cluster is configured. Finding a way that they can work together more effectively, so that they don't have to both understand each other's context, I think is helpful. And I think we're still in this kind of weird state where we haven't quite, helped developers build with the right low complexity stuff and build applications that are really simple to kind of understand and build. We've left them all the options open because containers can run anything, but we've maybe given them too many things to be concerned about. And I think that we have to do a bit more about giving. We get asked a lot about guidance and recommendations, and I think we need to actually simplify some of the stuff that's come out. And so trying to understand what the happy path, the golden paths, the right ways to build maintainable, understandable applications are, and I think is really important right now.
Yeah. You haven't used this word yet. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like what you're saying is you need to be a bit more opinionated.
Yeah, I think some more opinions. Yeah, I think that's
a tricky thing with open source, but I'm curious how you approach this sort of platform versus, you just said like the golden paths, or there are certain better ways.
Well, because the golden path term is used a lot by the platform teams who are trying to make their developers more productive. I think there's a few different focuses for platform teams. Some platform teams are in the business of like deciding what the platform is, but a lot of the really strong platform teams are in the business of looking to see what developers are doing and trying to guide them into a smaller number of paths that can be managed better and give them higher productivity and more commonality in the organization. This is how you containerize things. This is how you build things. This is how you operate them. This is the kinds of things that are going to be costly and you don't want to do. These are the things that are simple and cheap and you do want to do. And I think working on those paths and simplifying is really important.
Who's the typical buyer for Docker products? Is it a CTO? Is it individual developers?
It's usually a platform team or the VP of engineering. Sometimes it's a strategic thing, especially where it's about containerization in the cloud journey as a whole organization. And then it's more likely the CTO.
Yeah. Well, the reason that I asked the question is that oftentimes with big companies, the CFO or the CEO has to sign off eventually. And I'm curious if there's one thing that you wish those who, are not steeped in DevOps would better understand about the complexity you're talking about the ways that, developers' lives can be more efficient, about the ROI, thereof.
I think that one thing they can do is actually listen to the developers. Well, the developers will tell them, please help my CFO understand why our organization needs to use Docker. The developers are there, and there's a lot of organizations now who are much better at listening to developers. I think that modern software and the kind of repeatability, the security piece that comes from the way that containers are just deployed once and are trackable, that the audit trail you get from containers is still underestimated in how important it is in terms of understanding what's going on in the organization and forensics and those types of things. So Docker Scout is really backed by this kind of supply chain database of everything that you've built and deployed and what's in it and what's not in it and how it was built and where it came from. Those underpinnings are really powerful in terms of like understanding what's going on in your organization and really having observability over the software process. And I think that's still something that people are still discovering that they need. For a lot of larger organizations, they're just starting to understand those things because they built really often very, very complex processes around things like change control that were pre-container. And so they're kind of having to understand how to adapt those processes to actually, something that's way more efficient at scale, and actually lets them deploy and build software much faster. But it involves organizational change. And I think that speed thing is obviously really important to organizations because the old processes were very, very slow. My favorite change control story is I worked on a project years ago at Heathrow Airport. The change control process for everyone, every organization who worked in the entire airport was such that while Heathrow Terminal 5 was being brought up, nothing could change at all. So the prices in the duty-free shops could not be changed while the airport was being brought up. That was the kind of change control process that was historically seen as okay and normal and necessary to control what happens. Whereas with a containerized system, you've got a lot of metadata. You can understand the changes. You can trace them back to source code. You can see what the changes were. And you can manage change in a much more granular fashion. You don't have to freeze everything for years at a time.
Yeah, you're reminding me there was a period when I was at the New York Times where the entire iOS app, which had been built like in secret, like in Cupertino, it just had to be rebuilt. No changes could be allowed for like 9 months, or advertising might beg, please put this one change in, even though we're building the new thing. But I love that actual very physical example of the duty-free shop prices like couldn't change because it would all the downstream effects. You mentioned that the laptops that people who are using Docker are using has changed dramatically over the years. Is that more a function of Docker's partnerships with Microsoft and others, or is that actually just a developer trend that Windows machines are taking off again?
It's a mixture of different things. I mean, I think that Windows machines are predominantly a function of the kind of larger organizations tend to be very Windows focused. Banks, for example. Yeah. And although it's less strong than it used to be. There's more of a mixture, and there's more diversity in those organizations too. I think the Mac has been an interesting. I mean, developers love their laptops. Like, they're real power users, and they like fast, high performance, long battery life, nice screens because they stare at them all day, and they care about things like typeface rendering in a way that perhaps someone who's just watching videos might not care so much.
Yeah.
And
keyboards.
If you look, and keyboard. Oh yes, keyboards. And so they're very demanding. And there was a lot of complaints about the late Intel Macs, and people were moving away from Mac completely. And then Apple Silicon Macs came out, and they're like, oh, okay, these are really good. Developers are very, very obsessive about their machines. And I mean, there's all this question about a developer's just going to move everything, all their whole development environments to the cloud, but they've been quite reluctant to do that. And there's a bunch of reasons around it. But I think part of it is just the laptops have got better.
Absolutely. And I'm interested how, with the move to the cloud, how you've dealt with things like just the way things feel, or like latency and things like that. That which is, I'm guessing, is one of the hesitancies of people to move from desktop to cloud.
Yeah, I mean, our thesis at the moment is people don't want to actually move, for example, their editing environment to the cloud because that's the most latency sensitive piece. But we've done a lot of work in making things like the startup time for a remote build be as fast as possible. And often the performance can be higher because you've got more bandwidth in the cloud to pull things down, and you've got potentially more resources. But we've done a lot of performance work both on Docker Desktop locally and on the cloud interfaces, because it's it is really important. Like, if it feels slow, people won't use it. But yeah, that's why we don't think moving the editors to the cloud is where developers want to go right now, because that's the bit that the latency matters a lot.
Yep.
A lot of the other things you can, with careful caching and careful pre-work, doing things earlier, you can kind of work around it so it becomes less visible.
Yeah. I remember one of my favorite examples of this in the very early days was Spotify. Daniel Ek wanted, if you tapped on a piece of music, for it to stream, from the cloud instantly. And I think it was something like, it had to be less than 300 milliseconds, because his hypothesis was that if it didn't feel like it was on your phone, you weren't going to engage.
Yeah, and developers are very sensitive to it. So, for us, performance engineering is really important. And we've done a huge amount of performance engineering work on Docker Desktop because it wasn't good enough. And over the last year, it's become enormously faster. The startup time is now pretty much instantaneous again, like it was when we first launched it. It kind of slowed down, and the VM performance is like enormously faster than it used to be. Like, these are things that we focus on because we care, our users care, and it wasn't really sufficient before.
Yeah. I want to ask you one last question. I asked you about what's one thing CFOs and others should know, and you said they should just talk to their developers and listen to their developers. I'm curious I'm going to flip the question. Is there a way that developers, engineering managers, others can speak in ways that those, holding the purse strings will understand better? Do you have any one tip on like communication for developers or development managers?
Yeah, I think there's been been these attempts to like have these conversations about developer productivity and how to measure it, and DORA and space metrics, and like trying to use those as a way of kind of communicating in the organization. I don't know that they've been that great at having, making that dialogue make sense to the other half, because I think that they often seem to land sort of in between, because the developers on their own don't actually care about those metrics per se, because those metrics are metrics that are correlated with the developer being productive and having good experience, but they're not the way that the developer feels that. And those metrics also don't necessarily resonate with the CFOs, because they seem a bit like, why do I care how many times a day these people ship? Like, that doesn't seem
right.
like, so I think that, and there was a lot of complaints about the McKinsey study.
I saw that. Yeah.
So I think the conversation is not landing very well right now. I still think that we haven't found the right way of having those conversations. The best way for developers to communicate is to get better at communicating how they're working with customers and how they're focusing on business outcomes, because that's the language of the business. And I think that product focused and business focused engineers are becoming more common. Like, what are we bringing to the business? How are we helping the customers? What's getting better from the customer's point of view? I think that's the kind of the way that communication needs to work.
Justin, thank you so much. We could go on this topic and many others for a long time, but let's leave it there. Thank you. That's Docker CTO Justin Cormack. I'm Dan Blumberg, and this is Crafted. Crafted is brought to you in partnership with Docker. Learn more at docker.com. Special thanks to Artium, where I launched Crafted. Artium is a next-generation software development consultancy that combines elite human craftsmanship and artificial intelligence. See how Artium can help you build your future at artium.ai. And Crafted is produced by Modern Product Minds, where my team and I can help you take a new product from 0 to 1 and beyond. We specialize in early-stage product discovery, growth, and experimentation. Learn more and sign up for the Crafted newsletter at modernproductminds.com. Thanks so much, and please share Crafted with a friend.
I kind of hope this works, but I doubt it will.